Greetings, and welcome back to the Rose Bros podcast. This episode, we are joined by Dr. Chris Keefer, ER physician and nuclear advocate. Dr. Keefer is a ER physician at a hospital in Toronto and the president of Canadians for Nuclear Energy Association. In addition, he is the host of the Decouple Podcast, which focuses on energy technology and its ecological impacts. Dr. Keefer holds a bachelor's degree from Guelph University and a medical doctorate degree from McMaster University, where he completed his residency program. In addition, Dr. Keefer completed his emergency residency program at the University of Toronto in 2013. Among other things, we sat down and discussed the advantages of nuclear energy and how it impacts traditional energy. Enjoy. This podcast episode is sponsored by Conate Water Solutions. Do you need cost-effective water sourcing options to supply your next drilling or completions program? Conate Water Solutions is a specialized hydrogeology company focused on water well drilling, testing, and water management services in Western Canada and Texas. Contact info at conatewater.com or check out conatewater.com for more details. This podcast is sponsored by headracingcanada.com. Looking for high-performance ski gear this winter? In partnership with four-time Olympian Manny Osborne Parody, headracingcanada.com is offering the lowest prices possible through its online storefront by passing brick-and-mortar savings on to customers. Check out headracingcanada.com for more info and get your high-performance ski gear for the upcoming season. Okay, well, why don't we start?
Let's do it.
Greetings, Dr. Keefer.
Greetings, Trevor. Good to meet you.
Thanks a lot for doing this.
My pleasure.
For the listener, you are a ER doctor by training, but you are also a nuclear advocate. Have you always been a nuclear advocate? And when did you begin your medical practice, just for the listener?
You know, I didn't know what a nuclear advocate was until about probably 3 years ago. And that's probably the experience of your listenership as well. It's a relatively new phenomenon. And I guess we'll get into that later, but just to give you a bit more background on myself, I am a practicing emergency physician based out of Toronto. I've been working in Emerge for the last 10 years. And a little bit more about myself. I have a beautiful 4-year-old son who's kind of the light of my life. And I am the president of the nonprofit Canadians for Nuclear Energy, which is probably maybe how you found me. I'm not sure.
Are you practicing medicine during the day or at night?
All hours of the day, my friend. Yeah. The thing about Emerge shift work, you're just kind of programmed in when the department needs you. So I do tend to work more evenings, and that's how I have this other day job doing the nuclear thing. I should also plug the podcast. So I'm the host and senior editor of Decouple Media, Decouple Podcast. People want to check that out.
Absolutely. If anyone is listening, check the podcast out. But to get back to nuclear, how did you get into nuclear energy advocacy?
You know, around the time of the birth of my 4-year-old son, I started thinking a lot about climate change and took the regular sort of doomer alarmist path for some time as I read IPCC reports. You know, it was actually my ex-wife at the time who said, you know, you're being a total, bummer at parties. You know, why don't you do something about it? And what she meant was, you know, get better at sorting the recycling, take out the compost. And what I ended up sort of falling into, probably because of my scientific training through my medical degree, was things like nuclear and biotechnology, and essentially the kind of technologies that can decouple human well-being, all the benefits we've had from fossil fuels, from modernity, decouple those impacts, you know, those benefits from ecological impacts. So, you know, that leads you into thinking a lot about, again, things like nuclear energy, about, you know, biotechnology, tools that can, you know, enable us not only to mitigate climate change, but also adapt to it. You know, we're going to need a lot more energy if we need to desalinate water, for instance, if we need to run a lot more air conditioning in summer heat waves. We're going to need drought resistant crops, you know, for changing climate. So there's, you know, salt tolerant crops, et cetera. So I've really, you know, I've had a background for certain as someone who's been sort of skeptical of technology, or even kind of a, you know, in my youth, a bit of a Luddite view. And that's really changed as I've really come to see the necessity of, you know, humanity continuing to adapt, develop tools which create problems, develop new tools which solve those problems. Nothing's perfect, but the traditional environmental narrative I just found was not useful. It's just a kind of romantic idea that we can, you know, travel back in time to a mythical Garden of Eden, which never existed for humanity. So a lot of growth there, and that's kind of the philosophical underpinning. But lots of concrete reasons I can give the listenership around why I came to support nuclear energy and why I spend a lot of my time advocating for it now.
In terms of everyday power consumption and the average consumer, maybe just for the listener, what is nuclear energy?
It's phenomenologically radically different from any form of energy that we've ever used before. I mean, if you think historically back, in terms of what's called prime movers, what actually generated the power that we would use to, alter landscapes to survive, et cetera. It started just as muscle power, right? We had fire, but that was just used to heat ourselves. We hadn't learned how to turn thermal energy into kinetic energy, which was the whole Industrial Revolution. When we domesticated animals, we started harnessing muscle power, outside of our species. It's called extrasomatic energy, outside of our body energy. And that happened during the agricultural revolution when we domesticated animals. And then, we learned how to harness hydropower and wind power, many centuries ago. And finally, the Industrial Revolution, burning coal and later, gas and other forms of fossil fuels, turning what I mentioned before, that thermal energy into kinetic energy. And that's really responsible for the last 200-300 years of, just skyrocketing human development, and technological evolution. And, nuclear's, one of our latest innovations, and it moves beyond just making sort of chemical changes and forming and breaking bonds to harnessing, the energy, the strong nuclear force. That's the basis of, E equals mc squared, Einstein's great equation, which looked at that relationship between energy and mass. And, speed of light is a really big number. Squaring that's an even bigger number. So by turning tiny amounts of mass into energy, we can unlock, just enormous amounts of energy, and that's, on the negative side, what's behind the incredible destructive power of nuclear weapons, for instance. But on the positive side, it's behind all of the benefits, especially the environmental benefits of nuclear energy, which again, because you need so little input, means you need very little mining, means, a small power plant can produce, we have, power facilities here in Ontario, individual ones that produce, 30-40% of all of the electricity generation of the province on the footprint of, a large shopping mall, for instance, which means, we're not consuming a lot of resources, not consuming a lot of land to produce energy. And of course, producing zero air pollution and zero carbon emissions. So it's a very relevant form of energy. But in terms of how it works, in terms of a conventional nuclear power plant, it's just that you have a different thermal side. Instead of burning coal or gas to make steam and spin a turbine, you're doing that with nuclear heat. But everything on the, conventional side of the plant, is essentially identical. So it's a fancy way to boil water, essentially, but one that, again, has all of these environmental benefits. And I just find it's fascinating.
To get into the weeds a little bit, what's the difference between nuclear fission and nuclear fusion, and which one applies to energy consumption for people, the consumer?
Yeah, again, so it's all about the strong nuclear force, right? And that is released either when we split an atom, fission, or when we fuse an atom, fusion. And people are familiar with the sun, the power of the sun. That's all fusion, and it occurs because of the incredible temperatures, but really more importantly, the incredible mass and gravitational force of the sun, which creates an environment in which electrons are stripped off of hydrogen atoms, allowing these protons, which usually push each other apart, to fuse together, which releases a huge amount of energy, enough energy to power life on Earth. So it's very cool. The issue with it is that it's very hard to recreate those conditions here on Earth. We've been able to do it. The time that it's going to take in terms of the engineering challenges to turn that process, which is incredibly difficult to initiate, again, because it's hard to recreate the conditions of the sun here on Earth on a much smaller planet. I don't see it ever becoming a viable, scalable form of power generation, simply because of the engineering challenges. We discovered the phenomenon of fusion in the 1950s. I mean, the first attempts to create the conditions of something like the sun on Earth were the hydrogen bomb, right? Using fission to set off a fusion reaction. And, so we've discovered the phenomenon. I believe that was, in the 50s, Edward Teller, being the nuclear physicist that developed the hydrogen bomb. And we still haven't gotten anywhere close to a commercially viable form of power generation. On the fission side, I believe it was 1938 when we first learned how to, bombard uranium atoms with neutrons. And so from 1938 to the first power plant putting electricity on the grid was, 1956, I believe. So it's a pretty short time window. And it goes to show you that the engineering is much more simpler, and just the phenomenon of splitting atoms is much simpler than fusing them together. We have, commercially viable electricity generation, 18 years after the phenomenon is discovered. And currently, that provides, I think, 4 or 5% of global primary energy. It provides 20% of all electricity within the United States. I think about 40% of the clean electricity in Europe. Provides 60% of the power in my province here in Ontario. So it's proven itself to be, not only physically possible, but economically viable, and really, the driving force that drives society and industry in Canada's largest province.
From your perspective, why is nuclear energy the answer to our growing demand for energy?
I mean, there's no answer, shall we say. And I want to, start off by saying, we owe a lot of respect to fossil fuels. They underpin modern society. We take them completely for granted. When you have an energy crisis like we have now, or during the OPEC crisis, people start to see the elephant in the room. Everything around you, is either made from fossil fuels or is the product of an energy conversion that's generally relying on fossil fuels. So I don't know, I'm seeing like the cabinets behind you there. That's obviously made out of wood, but energy conversion was necessary in order to turn them into, the fine trim. And I know I can't see every detail of your cabinet, right? I mean, I can see some pictures on the walls. Those are all fabricated and meant. Your chair, I mean, it's made out of a bunch of hydrocarbons, looks like, anyway. I don't know if that's a leather or like fake leather. In any case, I mean, fossil fuels underpin so much of modern life, as a source material, and also, as a source of energy that, powers essentially everything, if not most things in our society, with trivial contributions from wind and solar. And I'll even say a fairly trivial contribution of nuclear. As we evolve, as we see the imperative, not only around climate change, but also things like energy security, and even, the finite nature of fossil fuels, we need to look at, transitioning to other forms of energy, and we need to transition to things that are at least equivalent, or hopefully better than fossil fuels. In some ways, for sort of stationary applications like power generation, I think, make the strong argument that nuclear is better than fossil fuels, certainly running in a baseload function. If we were able, particularly, to unleash the power of nuclear energy from overregulation and from some of the distorted electricity markets that really keep nuclear down, I think that's very competitive with things like coal and even natural gas, but provide additional benefits of lack of air pollution and carbon pollution. Nuclear does not produce the 600 products that a barrel of oil does, for instance. So it's not as good in that respect. It can produce high temperatures to run industrial processes, but not temperatures equivalent to that the combustion of fossil fuels can. So when talking about an energy transition, what are we making comparisons to in terms of moving past fossil fuels? Really, the options are pretty limited. It's things like nuclear, potentially geothermal, if we can really turn some of that deep drilling technology into a viable way to, harness that molten lava essentially underneath the Earth's crust, and things like wind and solar, which are just so demonstrably worse than fossil fuels that they don't represent a viable transition. And it's why they require a huge amount of subsidy and really piggyback on the back of reliable sources of energy like fossil fuels and sometimes nuclear energy. So, I think there is an imperative. Climate change is a serious thing. It's going to have impacts potentially, certainly on century type scales. My child or my child's child is definitely going to have their lives fairly impacted by climate change. And so there's that kind of an imperative to start, making a move past fossil fuels, but also we know fossil fuels are finite, and, that peak oil and peak gas, are certainly, knowable phenomena. The question is kind of when. I think a transition to nuclear energy is inevitable because we need to use a high energy return on energy invested tool in order to, again, maintain everything that we sort of take for granted in our modern life, like things like healthcare, in my field.
A lot of people who advocate energy transition or different energy sources are biased because they may own an interest in the energy source, or they're not willing to acknowledge the importance of traditional energy. But you seem to, A, not have an interest in a nuclear reactor, and B, are willing to acknowledge the importance of traditional energy and just how hard the transition is, and are willing to take a pragmatic view. How did you come to that conclusion? What led you to nuclear, and how were you able to realize the importance of a pragmatic transition and just the importance of the energy structure as it is currently?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and to clarify, because I think when people hear nuclear advocate, their natural assumption is like, you must be working for the industry, you must be getting a kickback. I do not. My income comes from OHIP or Medicare, the Ontario Health Insurance Plan. This is a very bizarre obsession and sort of pet hobby. But, in terms of how I came to this view, I had a much more simplistic view, certainly earlier on. I have a background on the political left. And there's some value to some of the ideas on the political left. Like I still am very much in favor of, robust public services like healthcare and education. But now I recognize that those rely upon an industrial society, on actually producing wealth within your society. That's the cream with which we're able to create these, humanitarian, beautiful services that I think the left values. But, the left has become so divorced from production, from industry, from an understanding of supply chain that is frankly, delusional when it comes to things like energy policy, agriculture, any number of things, because, the left essentially used to, try and, mobilize workers in factories and, draw from that base people who actually know how the world works. And then, in the 50s and 60s, lost their competition with the Soviet Union. Life got pretty good for working people in, in Europe and the United States and Canada, for instance. The left said, well, these workers are traders. The new revolutionary vanguard is students. So we're going to move to the universities, and we're going to move to the humanities and the sociology departments and the political science departments. And they're completely out of touch now. So coming from the left, I think I had a very simplistic view of how the world worked initially, and a kind of demonization of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are like cigarettes or something, and we just need to stop smoking. And again, as I've studied this, as I've had more than 200 experts on my podcast and really had an opportunity to learn from them, I've developed a much more, frank and nuanced way of understanding the world. If we were to follow the dictates of Extinction Rebellion and leave, all the oil and gas in the ground, their predictions of billions dead in 10 years would come true, because we wouldn't have the hydrogen feedstock necessary for and the heat energy necessary for the Haber-Bosch process, and we'd have no synthetic fertilizer, which that's the nitrogen and fundamentally the protein source for half of humanity on this planet. So clearly we need a more nuanced and pragmatic approach. I am increasingly frustrated with net zero language, because I think anyone who really, and I talk to people who use it, and I say, like, between you and I, do you believe this is a possibility on a decade's time frame, on a century's time frame, ever? And they're pretty quick to acknowledge, kind of behind the scenes, that it's BS. It's not achievable. But there's this discourse, and I'm kind of sympathetic, I think, to this idea of like an aspirational politics, like let's shoot for the stars and maybe land on the moon. But when you're proposing something that's just not compatible with physics or with, not just human flourishing, but human survival, I think that's pretty foolish. So that's certainly an example, I think, of the kind of pragmatism sinking into my work. Again, I would put myself in the camp of being alarmed by climate change, particularly on the kind of timescales of having a child who's, hopefully going to be alive and well in 2100. I think we are going to see some pretty significant changes and challenges. But the solutions to those things are pragmatic and not puritanical. So yeah, I mean, that's a bit of my evolution.
We'll get back to nuclear energy maybe in a sec, but one thing that caught my eye, I guess, in terms of your advocacy was that you take, like I said, a pragmatic approach. One tweet I read from you was about a month ago: the modern left is suffering from a novel form of alienation, total alienation from production itself. Having abandoned the factory floor for the university lecture hall, its thinkers have become utterly detached from material reality. It shows. That really caught my eye about a month ago. Do you think that would be a good summary of maybe your current thinking on things and how it relates to energy and whatnot?
Yeah, for sure. And like I said, I mean, I don't feel like I've changed my core values, right? Like I think that, a healthy society is one that's generally more equal. And there's a constant tension, particularly in a capitalist society, between, not just the kind of 1%ers, but the billionaires. Probably soon we'll have trillionaires walking the earth, and everyday working and middle class people. And there are tensions in society. Like, we need the dynamism that tends to occur within certain sectors of capitalism. But we also need some kind of a redistributive force to make sure that people don't fall through the cracks. And that tends to be organized labor. One of the reasons I support nuclear is because it tends to cultivate a very skilled workforce, one that has a strong negotiating position, whether it's unionized or not. It's simply hard to find scab labor and replacements if those folks say, hey, you know what, if we're not getting a good enough contract, we're going to go on strike. That's a big deal. And you can't just bring in scab labor in the way you can with things like wind and solar, which are really workerless, certainly once constructed. But in terms of, the workforces that install wind turbines and solar panels, especially solar panels, these people are absolutely replaceable and have no negotiating position. So I think, like, within a healthy society, there's these tensions and you need balancing of various forces. So, am I still kind of left in certain ways? Yeah. Like, I believe in some form of redistribution of wealth within society, and that you need an actor. And that tends to be labor, organized labor, in order to achieve that balance. Again, as I mentioned before, I appreciate, especially as a doctor working in Canada, the fact that, I can provide care to just about to anybody who walks through the door, and I'm not, checking their wallet first. I think that's a high virtue of a developed society and a wealthy society. But I recognize that lies on top of a productive economy, an economy with energy workers, an economy that's, got factories, that's building things. And, the modern left, it's incredible reading, some of the fantasies. We're no longer going to have any mining because we're just going to mine our garbage dumps. Like, just no understanding of even recycling. Like steel. Yeah. I mean, it takes a lot of energy, but you can recycle steel, aluminum, right? There's certain things that are kind of still in their pure form that are recyclable. But in terms of, even things like a solar panel, you could try and get some silver out of it, but in focusing on the silver, you lose all the other stuff. And again, very energy intensive. So, there's just this complete fantasy world of circular economies, et cetera. And it's interesting to discover why the left is so mistaken on these things. And I think it really lies in what I describe in that tweet. This, Marx talked about the alienation of the working class, as they were moved into factories, from things they produced, from those products, but also from the way they would work. If you think about like a shepherd or a farmer, there's some choice in an agency, if you're running a farm, in terms of how you run the farm. And that's kind of, I guess, a nice thing, and something that he felt was a problem with everybody working into factories and making widgets and doing one thing on a production line. That's, I guess, a form of alienation. But yeah, as I said in that tweet, the modern left is alienated entirely from any kind of production. And they live in this fantasy world, and therefore make these fantasy policies responding to real problems like climate change with the most stupid, counterproductive, puritanical solutions, which are going to get people killed. So anyway, the world's upside down. I think I've just gained a more nuanced appreciation across the political spectrum. And, as a result, I talk to all kinds of different people in my podcast. And certainly, like, some of my crusty left listeners are like, you shouldn't talk to that guy because he's a climate denier, or that guy because he worked in the Reagan administration on, weapons and missile defense, and I'm like, just go to hell. Like, I'll talk to whoever I want. And like, we shouldn't stay silent. That's so much of the problem with the, contemporary political discourse. Probably much more so on the left than the right, is this idea that, people can and people should be canceled because, they published in this publication, or they hold this one belief. I'm not talking about that belief, but they've got a lot of expertise in this other area. Anyway, so that's, I guess, how I've evolved politically, but still maintained a lot of, my core values.
Did you think of that in terms of giving yourself credibility? Because from my perspective, it gives you credibility. Have you, or that just come naturally to you, kind of seeing a viewpoint from all sides?
In terms of like other divides other than political and left and right, I think, we're both in Canada. I think one of the biggest divides is rural and urban, right? It's almost like we don't talk to each other. I was born in rural Nova Scotia, raised in rural Ontario. I live in Toronto now, the most populous city. I had a very interesting life before university. I was a horse wrangler, hunting guide, up in the Yukon, worked for this crazy Albertan rancher. Like, and I now advocate, in Ottawa and provincially. And I'm able to, speak to and almost like speak a number of different languages. Like, it's almost like rural Canada speaks a different language. Like, we all speak English, but it's different. And so, yeah, it's been helpful to have that nuance and also just that appreciation. Like, there's a great book by this author and social psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, called The Righteous Mind. And, he's really talking about how, like, why is it that in every society there is a kind of political left and a political right? There are conservatives, there are liberals, there's people on far spectrums. Like, why does that exist? And he traces it back to our early days as hunter-gatherers, and that, it's just from an evolutionary perspective, it was helpful to have, even if it's a micro society, like a group of like 40 people working together to hunt and gather, you needed different sets of values and people that prioritize different values. And so, like, a healthy democratic society also has that and has those tensions, and we squabble and should figure it out, but we need to be talking and interacting with one another. So just that appreciation, I think, helps me to engage across the political spectrum. And really, nuclear is a pan-partisan issue. Like, you can talk to people on the left, even the far left, and say, hey, nuclear has the highest union density. It provides great quality jobs. It deals with your climate concerns. Actually the most effective of any energy form. You can talk to people on the political right who value economic growth and economic flourishing and say, listen, I mean, energy, cheap, abundant, affordable energy is what, lays underneath, a productive society. It allows economic dynamism and flourishing. So this is the reason you should support it. I mean, it can have appeal right across the political spectrum if explained in the terms, that are important to the various people. And so, again, having a bit of a background on the left and the kind of labor left, I can talk to those folks. And there's a lot of labor unions that are really coming around and seeing the benefits of nuclear, especially compared to wind and solar, which, are an absolute dystopia for working people, and why I think there's so much very well-founded skepticism when you go and talk to, for instance, oil patch workers and say, hey, we got a just transition lined up for you. It's going to result in a 50% pay cut, and you're going to be doing a really boring job that doesn't take advantage of any of your skills. People can see through the bullshit on that, pardon my language.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Maybe I'm kind of heading off course here, but, hopefully that gives you a sense of, I think, how that varied background, helps in terms of, how I'm able to speak and convince people. And I think, it's working because we've seen a real U-turn on nuclear, from the federal government. I think this is a really exciting period, for nuclear, which is again, good for broader society.
Risk, to think of it critically from the other side. The worry with nuclear energy is nuclear waste, I guess you could say in simplistic terms, and or explosion or something along those lines. When you're thinking of it from the other side, how do you explain the risks? How do you mitigate the risks? Or how do you, I guess, deal with that side of nuclear energy?
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think of it from a medical framework. Every day at my job, whether it's discussing, investigations, how do we figure out what's going on here, treatments, et cetera, there's always some risk involved in anything that I do in medicine. And so I have these informed consent discussions with patients where I say, hey, these are the risks of doing this. These are the benefits, and these are the alternatives. You decide, right? It's important to not take that in isolation, right? I mean, generally speaking, people need those things because they're sick, right? And maybe the alternative on the energy front is, energy poverty is a bad thing. That will make you sick. And we have to look, okay, so there are alternatives, right? There's alternatives to nuclear. Here's what they are, right? And so it's important to assess the risks, benefits, and alternatives of every energy choice. And I'm not going to say that nuclear has zero problems, but what I will say is the bugaboos like waste and accidents have been so blown out of proportion. And that's been by the environmental movement, the people supposedly most concerned about climate change, who I say it's kind of like when I was watching the World Cup. I mean, they're scoring own goals on themselves based upon what they actually say their concerns are. So, in talking about waste, people are terrified about nuclear waste. So there's a few important things. I mean, we were all educated on what waste is by The Simpsons, and it's this, glowing green goop, which just is seeping into waterways and creating three-eyed fish, etc. The cool thing about nuclear waste, and again, what actually makes it the most environmentally friendly form of energy, is that we produce tiny amounts of it. Remember, E equals MC squared. There's a gobsmacking amount of energy in a tiny, tiny amount of uranium. And so, a couple truckloads of fuel will run a large scale nuclear plant, which, if it was coal, would be, daily deliveries of, 100-car coal cars, for instance, right? And so very little goes in and very little comes out. So all of the spent nuclear fuel, which is the waste that we really worry about, that's come out of nuclear reactors in Canada in the last 70 years, would fit on one hockey rink stacked one telephone pole high. So from a volume perspective, that's an important part of waste management, right? I mean, the amount of coal ash we produce, for instance, or just the amount of CO2, those are really almost unmanageable problems. How manageable is it to deal with that volume of waste? In terms of where you're going to put it, like that becomes a very manageable thing. Now, there's challenges of the radioactivity of that waste, right? The fuel that comes straight out of the reactor, it's irradiated fuel. It is incredibly potent. If you were to stand next to it unshielded, you'd get a fatal dose in seconds and have a really nasty, horrible death. And it's kind of cool, the physiology of that, but I'll spare you that. Yet somehow we haven't had a single death related to radiation from spent nuclear fuel, from storing civilian spent nuclear fuel in the history of nuclear power. That's 70 years. And that's because radiation as a toxin is the easiest thing we have to detect in the world. We have, Geiger counters, which can detect the decay of a single atomic nucleus. So we know exactly where it is and we are able to measure it. So again, how is it that this substance that comes out of a nuclear reactor screaming hot that could kill you in seconds unshielded hasn't killed anyone in the history of storing spent civilian nuclear waste? Well, it's because we know how to shield it, and shielding it is fairly simple. So when you take fuel out of a reactor, you do it underwater and it stays underwater, and water is an incredible shield for radiation. We put it into spent fuel, thermally let it cool off for 5 to 10 years, and then we put it into these concrete and steel lined containers. And that might sound like a complicated process. It's a polar crane essentially moving fuel bundles around. But I want you to compare it to another industry that has really a lot of risk associated with it, and that would be aviation. And the reason I bring this up is that in a modern society, with competent engineering, et cetera, we make dangerous things safe, right? So aviation, like you've flown on an airplane, I imagine. I just got back from beautiful vacation down in Utah. I got into this aircraft, really almost like paper thin, either it's aluminum or carbon fiber fuselage. We're up at 30,000 feet. The oxygen level is, 1/3 what it is here. You die essentially if the plane's not pressurized. There's probably 10,000 mission critical moving parts in that airplane that need, like, on a tight maintenance schedule. There's air traffic control. There's pilot skill. There's, human factors, crew resource management, an incredible amount of effort that goes into making something that is inherently insanely dangerous into one of our, probably our most, safe form of transportation. Certainly, I think 17 times safer than driving a vehicle, which is actually very safe as well because of all the engineering that's gone into, making cars fold up like little accordions to preserve the passengers inside. We make dangerous things safe. And think about the complexity of keeping an airplane in the sky. It's way more complicated than dealing with this tiny volume of spent nuclear fuel that we have. But people say, hey, this stuff's going to be dangerous forever. And that's also a critical misconception. When you split the atom, you create a bunch of byproducts. And some of them are highly radioactive. The cool thing is they have very short half-lives. And so you have this thing called exponential radioactive decay. So within 40 years, 99.9% of that radiation is gone, right? So that's pretty cool. Within, of 500-600 years, the only way that nuclear waste could harm you is if you crushed it into a fine powder and consumed it, either, did lines of it like cocaine, or ate it. Like that's a very, very interesting phenomenon because people are worried about it forever and ever and ever, right? And it starts to get back to the level of radioactivity of the ore from which it came within 1,000 years. So this is not a forever type problem. It does require management. But it's something that we're very capable as human beings of dealing with. And that's a critical difference between the environmental left and this kind of group of sort of eco-pragmatists that I belong to, is we have a real appreciation and faith in the ability of humanity to do cool things, right? And, fundamentally as a waste stream, it takes resources and time and skill to manage. But again, it is far more easy than managing the true forever waste of, toxic heavy metals, produced, from coal, for instance. But also, mining produces an insane amount of very dangerous elements that aren't radioactive and therefore don't decay and are truly there forever. Like in the Giant Mine in Northwest Territories, there was a gold mine up there. Part of the process involved, creating the byproduct of arsenic trioxide. And there's enough arsenic in that mine to kill every single human being on the planet 3 times over. How are we keeping it safe? Well, to keep it from mixing with water and waking its way out into Great Slave Lake, which it already has to some degree, they're freezing the ground all around it, and, that system, that relies on human beings to run for quite a while. I'm just saying, like, we have to put it in context, risk, benefits, and alternatives, and all of the benefits that come from nuclear power. I think the waste is a very small price to pay. There are sort of more permanent solutions. And the cool thing about nuclear waste is 95% of it is actually harvestable energy with different kinds of reactor technology. So it's really a resource for the future. And then if you really are stupid enough that you want to bury it underground forever, there's rock formations which are entirely suitable to isolate it, forever and ever. The rock formation that we're looking at here in Ontario, like the only mechanism for waste to get out in harm anyone, it doesn't blow up, it doesn't go critical and volcano out of the ground. Water has to leach in, dissolve it, which it's a solid ceramic. That's very hard to do, and then carry it out through the rock and somehow get up to the biosphere. But we have a rock formation in Ontario here. It takes between 3 and 30 million years for water to percolate 1 meter through it. So that is an incredible barrier. Like, it's manageable, very, very manageable. So it's a bogeyman, again, that's been blown up by the antis. And, the accident thing, I mean, I've gone on for a long time here. I like to sort of like punctuate the conversation and not have a lecture from me. But, on the accident front, it's fascinating because, North America, for instance, there's not been a single death from radiation from a nuclear accident. Really, worldwide, except for the Soviet Union, there's not been a single death from radiation as a result of a nuclear accident. Fukushima, for instance, people would be surprised about because they've heard there's 20,000 people that died. That was from the earthquake and tsunami, right? Like a massive event, meltdown of 3 reactors, which resulted in what? Not a single death from radiation. I think like the key thing that drives the psychology of anti-nuclear folks, it's very generational, right? Is like my dad's generation, right? They grew up under the constant fear of nuclear Armageddon. And let's be totally frank and clear. There are enough nuclear weapons in the world to, eliminate humanity from the face of the world, both through the, just the physical explosions and kinetic energy there, but also like a nuclear winter that would result. We'd actually have severe climate change and planetary cooling from all of the dust that would go into the atmosphere and block the heat of the sun. So that's what lies at the heart of anti-nuclear anxiety and the motivation for their activism. Now, there's this kind of fantasy that you could put the nuclear genie back in the bottle, that you could take all nuclear technology and stuff it in the bottle and then nuclear weapons would disappear. And it's just a bad premise to begin with, because geopolitics are such that that's not how it works. And also it's just physically impossible to eliminate, expertise and knowledge of nuclear technology. And we wouldn't want to. Because we're not thinking about things like all of the medical elements of nuclear technology, right? So, I mean, we have research reactors, power reactors, which are responsible for instance, producing cobalt-60, which is used to sterilize just the stuff we make here in Ontario. 40% of the entire world's single-use medical devices are sterilized with cobalt-60, which you can only produce in nuclear reactors. That's like 25 billion pieces of individual medical equipment. Like it's insane. And, how many lives have we saved by having, sterile conditions in hospitals, for instance? And again, I mean, there's this idea that you can put the nuclear genie back in the bottle. You could eliminate power plants. I mean, you'd have to eliminate research reactors as well, which produce medical isotopes. I mean, I was at a cool one down in Hamilton. They use something called neutron radiography. Every single blade on every jet turbine made in North America moves through this facility because you need to make sure that, these individual turbine blades are perfect. Otherwise, people are going to fall out of the sky. As we mentioned, aviation's risky, but we make risky things safe by things like this. So you'd have to shut down every research reactor in the world because they could conceivably be diverted to making weapons, or the expertise of those who work there. You need to like lobotomize and scramble the brains of every single nuclear engineer and nuclear physicist. Like, it's just, you cannot put this genie back in the bottle. And frankly, there's a really positive side to nuclear energy. Not just the medical side. We can obviously all agree on that, I think. But in terms of the energy benefits, I mean, here in Ontario, we were able to phase out coal. It was 25% of our grid, and that's been estimated by the Ontario Medical Association to save 1,000 lives per year, 30,000 hospitalizations per year. So there's been a huge benefit to nuclear energy, all around the world for a whole number of reasons. And again, the premise of the antis is if we get rid of every power reactor in the world, somehow nuclear weapons are magically going to disappear, and that's just not going to happen. So, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but in terms of, the danger of accidents, it was an unknown how dangerous they would be up until we had 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. Chernobyl was really the worst case scenario. And outside of the Soviet Union, there's not been a single death as a result of radiation from a nuclear accident. So 3 Mile Island, average dose received by the surrounding population, a chest X-ray. Like it's sweet F all. In Japan, again, this is really a worst case scenario. You had 3 gigawatt scale reactors melt down simultaneously. 20,000 people died from the earthquake and tsunami, 0 from radiation from this nuclear accident. You might go, well, I heard they're having like $100 billion cleanup. Well, that's because we're so afraid of radiation. The level of radiation that naturally occurs from the soil, from cosmic rays, et cetera, around the world varies massively. From where we are, it's 2 millisieverts a year. There's somewhere in Iran 100 times higher. We don't see an increase in cancer rates because these are all within a fairly low dose range. And the amount of radiation that escapes the nuclear plant, even in a worst case scenario, is a low dose. And so the deaths that have occurred because of nuclear accidents, again, outside of Chernobyl and the Soviet Union, are really from fear, from rushed, panicked evacuations. And that fear is stoked by anti-nuclear activists, who revel in a nuclear accident, almost cackle with glee. And, when you look at the Chernobyl accident, you probably heard, I mean, what's your take? How many people died? If you just had to fathom a guess, how many people died as a result of, the radiation released from Chernobyl?
I'm by no means an expert or educated in the subject, but I would say hundreds.
Okay, that's pretty low. I think probably you're biased because you're talking to me.
I'm very biased because I'm talking to you.
Yeah. Okay. So leave behind that bias. Just guess you probably know I'm going to say actually it was much lower than that.
Right.
But honestly, if you weren't having this conversation with me, what would the number be that you'd guess?
Well, in terms of the actual impact on the surrounding area, I did know that a lot of it was just that slow death. You die 30 years later because of the radiation. So I don't know. I guess off the cusp it would be thousands. But like I said, I'm not educated.
Yeah. And I mean, it's reasonable for you to have that assumption because there's reports out there and studies on the high end that will say 1 million premature deaths as a result of Chernobyl. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is truly a catastrophe, right? Mm-hmm. Now, there's other studies that say 100,000. There's another study that says 30,000. And there's, a study that says less than 100. Mm-hmm. So why is there that vast degree of findings from so-called scientific studies? Well, I think, as we've seen in the COVID era, you can't just call something science and say, well, it's factual. You have to, look at the article that was published. You have to look for sources of bias within it. You have to look at the methodology. Was it a well-done study or not? This whole trust the science, turn off your brain, the science thing is hugely detrimental to society. So if you actually look at the Million study, it's primary author, 2 authors, only 2 scientists involved, is the founder of Greenpeace Russia. And when you look at the methodology of the study, it's like newspaper clippings. It's conference abstracts. It attributes every excess death since Chernobyl to Chernobyl. And there was a really important event that happened about 5 years after Chernobyl, and that was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that was a massive economic contraction, a complete, implosion of their social services, outbreaks of things like tuberculosis, but probably much more damaging alcoholism. There's lots of reasons why the mortality rate went up when their entire political and economic system collapsed, right? So a really poor quality study, 2 authors with an enormous amount of bias. The founder of Greenpeace Russia, right? That's the 1 million person study. One of the other studies that was in the tens of thousands was the other report on Chernobyl. This was a European Green member of parliament who got 3 anti-nuclear scientists to do a report. Very questionable methodology, right? And the report that says 100 people, that's done by the Chernobyl Forum. That's 8 UN agencies, the World Health Organization, the Food and Agricultural Organization, a number of UN agencies, hundreds of scientists in collaboration with the 3 most affected countries, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And they find less than 100, right? And that's based upon a consensus of hundreds of scientists bickering and arguing for years and years and years. And so, I mean, if you look at the methodology of that study, it is sound and rigorous. And, in medicine, we face this all the time, right? Should we trust the study? Should we change our treatments based upon it? And, we develop what we call critical appraisal skills to look at individual studies and say, hey, does this, pass the bar? And frankly, a huge amount of what's published in medical journals is proven to either be fraudulent or, poor methodology. So you really need to learn how to, separate the wheat from the chaff on this. Anyway, so, it's understandable that you have the perspective that you do. I would say that Chernobyl was an accident. I wouldn't call it a catastrophe, except again for the response to it, which involved creating this huge evacuation zone and telling everybody that just what you thought. You're going to die in 30 years from radiation. So you might as well keep smoking because it's going to get you anyway. You might as well drink like a fish because you're going to die anyway. Even the folks who got the skin melting doses of radiation, there's about 138. 28 of them died from acute radiation syndrome. Those survivors, almost all of them haven't died from causes attributable to radiation. Even those most affected, right? And what we worry about on a population level is, well, what about slightly increased doses of radiation? Will that increase your chance of cancer going forward? There's one kind of cancer that was elevated after Chernobyl, and that was thyroid cancer because of a isotope of iodine that got out and affected children in particular. That's a tragedy. Luckily, thyroid cancer is the most treatable form of cancer essentially we have, with a less than 1% mortality rate. And that's where, that number that gets up to 100, in addition to those who died because of getting, firefighters that got thermal burns and people that got acute radiation sickness. That's how you get to about that 100 number. We have, television, HBO series like Chernobyl, great television, but, communicating massive falsehoods here. And again, why do I spend so much time advocating on this issue? I think it's super important, for the ongoing flourishing of human civilization, but B, because it's really misunderstood. And it's almost like it's weird thinking about a technology as an underdog, but it requires a lot of, careful communication, to myth bust on it essentially, and then unleash, its potential. And, I don't know who your audience is. I may be going over their heads. I may be going under their heads. It's all about, I guess figuring out how to communicate that message, in the right sort of terms to people. But again, I think it's a really important message to get out there.
Research and development, like you were saying, is a big part of making nuclear energy safe. I think I read somewhere if the R&D going into nuclear had kept up at a pace that's similar to most industries, we would have been way farther ahead. From your perspective, if we had kept investing in R&D nuclear energy, where would we be nowadays instead of it falling off a cliff?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't agree to that premise exactly. I mean, again, just like aviation, it requires a lot of, the human factors are super important. The skills are super important. And those skills are there. There's certainly, novel reactor technologies, which are promising and interesting. As I mentioned, 95% of what we call spent nuclear waste actually, has a huge amount of energy potential within it. And so that should certainly be worked on. There's no urgency to do that because we're not short on uranium whatsoever. What's held nuclear back? It's really interesting. I mean, the regulatory stuff priced it out of the market to some degree. I mean, in the early days of nuclear in the 60s, it was cheaper than coal. Imagine that nuclear had been sustained at a level cheaper than coal. We probably wouldn't be burning coal anymore. We'd be way, way back in terms of our, total carbon emissions. We would have way less air pollution, way less toxic, it's not tailings, fly ash, et cetera, right? So that's certainly an issue, the way that nuclear has been regulated. If you applied the regulations that apply to nuclear energy to any other form of energy, it'd be out of business, 100%. The only thing that's maintained nuclear energy is, again, equals MC squared, the incredible amount of reliable energy you can get out. In terms of pragmatically what's held back nuclear recently, is that there hasn't been the energy security imperative and there hasn't been the demand there. So where has nuclear energy flourished? It's flourished in places that are not endowed with fossil fuels. So France is probably the best example. They said, there's this saying in French, nous avons pas de pétrole, mais nous avons des idées. We don't have oil, but we have ideas, right? So after World War II, a lot of engineering expertise, a lot of nuclear physics expertise, and the oil, oil was dirt cheap, man, in the 60s, right? And then, as the Arabs started to say, hey, wait a minute, it's not fair that we're being plundered by the West, and started to say, hey, you're not allowed to, cakewalk around here. and jacked up the price of oil. I mean, it was being used for power generation. Like, how crazy is that?
Still is in some places.
In some places, yeah, exactly. I mean, especially up north, right? But not in a large way, because it's too valuable and it's more expensive. But France was, good chunk of their grid was powered by oil, and they got hit hard by that oil shock. They don't have a lot of coal. Germany has a shit ton of coal, and that's part of why their energy policy has been different. So France went gangbusters, and there's also a period of big economic growth, and they commissioned 56 reactors in 15 years. You'll hear, oh, nuclear is too slow. 56 reactors in 15 years. If you have a society that's organized, capable, and competent, that doesn't apply worldwide for sure. But I think that can apply to places like Canada and the US. And there's reasons why we're not doing it. In Ontario as well, it's not just, well, the French did it. I mean, there must be something special about the French. Like, no. In Ontario, we commissioned 20 large nuclear reactors in 20 years. Just an incredible pace of growth, bigger and faster than the James Bay Hydro project in Quebec, which kind of really underpins Quebec's electricity and energy security. So nuclear gets deployed where fossil fuels are scarce or insecure. So Japan, for instance, why was it 30% nuclear powered? Well, because it's an island that burned through its coal in its initial industrialization, doesn't have oil, doesn't have gas, right? They're the number one importer of liquefied natural gas in the world. And so, yeah, I mean, having this fuel source, which you import, but it's, again, as I mentioned, equals MC squared. There's a tiny amount of it. You can store years worth on site. It's a huge energy security play, and it reduces your fossil fuel costs, right? And the critical ingredient is that you have demand growth, right? This is a capital intensive project. You need billions and billions of dollars to build a nuclear plant. Once it's built, it can last 80, maybe 100 years. It's like a hydro dam. It lasts not forever, but a really long time. It's a good investment, good long-term investment, but it costs a bunch of money up front. If you don't have a guarantee of demand for those kilowatt hours once it's built, then no one financial is going to get into to financing that cash up front, right? Or the cost of capital will be too expensive. So that's a really, really key variable. And what's happened since the 70s and 80s in North America and much of the industrialized world, electricity demand cratered, plateaued, fell off, right? And so there hasn't been that imperative to build more nuclear. What we're seeing now, and kind of a nuclear renaissance that's kind of in the making is, when Russia cut off gas to Europe, huge fuel security issues. Europe's not endowed with a lot of fossil fuels. So there's an imperative to build nuclear for, geostrategic reasons and because fossil fuels are getting expensive, right? Why is Ontario looking to build more large and small nuclear right now? Obviously it's nice if we can do it for climate change reasons, but there's pragmatic reasons. We're going to see enough immigration that we'll have, 1 million more households in Ontario. We currently have 4.5 million households. That's a big draw on demand. We discovered that, hey, offshoring all our industry to China was a bit of a mistake. We've got some geopolitical reality check. We should bring some of that industry home, build some new factories, right? Electrify some of our production. So we're seeing a real organic economic demand increase in terms of all of our forecasts. So that's why you're going to build nuclear. So again, I hope I'm explaining sort of why nuclear died. There's many, many reasons. Or I shouldn't say died, but went stagnant. Many, many countries all around the world had a beauty period where they built a lot of nuclear really fast. I mean, the US built like 100 reactors in 20, 30 years. I mentioned Canada, France. Japan was at their best got a reactor online in under 4 years. Now the global average is 8 years. So what I'll say in terms of nuclear is the drawback is that it's hard. It takes excellence. It takes expertise. It takes those human factors. It takes, incredible project management skills in terms of construction to get everything right. We've seen it go wrong in, the US and Europe with their most recent nuclear builds, first of a kind designs, workforces that had never done nuclear before because they hadn't built anything in 30 years, supply chains that were not geared up, delivering modules to the Vogtle nuclear station that didn't fit together. It's supposed to fit together like Lego and speed up construction. Well, your module shows up and it's off by like 3 feet. Huge delays, right? Which don't inspire a lot of confidence, frankly. But for instance, here in Ontario, the great thing about our national reactor technology, the CANDU, is that it has a core which you can swap out. So it's almost an immortal plant. The thing that limits the lifespan of a CANDU is essentially all the concrete in the building. And concrete lasts quite a long time. Swapping out that internal core is a $3 billion mega project. It's worth it because it gets you another 40 years of round the clock juice out of the plant, but a mega project, and things that are very prone to going over budget. And, we're proving we're ahead of schedule and on budget on those refurbishment projects. So that means that, we're well equipped to do new nuclear, that we have those human factors, that project management excellence to move forward. So Canada, I think, there is a global return to nuclear energy, and Canada has the potential to be a serious leader, with enormous economic benefit. Because the thing about, again, having a national reactor technology and a supply chain, like the CANDU supply chain is 96% made in Canada. Every dollar we invest in Canada nuclear, we get $1.40 back in GDP, because you're paying a bunch of middle-class people excellent incomes, and then they, build nice houses in their community, or, recycle that money in local businesses. So you get a huge economic boost. You get great quality, like intergenerational jobs. It's really a win-win-win, because normally when we think about doing something environmental, it's like, oh, we all got to tighten our belts and suffer economically. And it's like, no. We can have no air pollution. We can have no carbon emissions. We can have fantastic jobs and a vibrant, thriving economy and communities. For me, that's the positive vision. Because usually when you think of nuclear, and when I'm interviewed, I'm like, well, the waste isn't so bad. The accidents aren't so bad. Blah, blah, blah. It's always on the defense and sort of like responding to negative perception. But it's like, there is a very positive story to tell here. And again, one of environmental action and also economic flourishing. So once that story is told, I think it becomes inspiring. And, in addition to those energy security imperatives and potential fossil fuel scarcity, which is not something that Canada suffers from, it's leading in certain parts of the country to a serious interest in nuclear.
Is there room for private industry in nuclear energy?
Oh, 100%. 100%. Yeah. So, all of our nuclear assets in Canada are owned by public utilities. But, the largest nuclear plant in the world is actually in Ontario, Bruce Power. It's a, public-private partnership. So it's run by a private company, Bruce Power, but Ontario Power Generation, the public corporation, owns the site. You look at a supply chain map for those CANDU refurbishments I was mentioning, hundreds of businesses, like all across Ontario. So obviously these are all private businesses, which are supplying the supply chain, and, massive economic stimulus, as I was mentioning. In terms of, mobilizing private capital to invest, yeah, there's a huge interest. BMO, Royal Bank, Bank of Montreal have all released, very bullish statements on nuclear energy. Again, there's risk in terms of financing, particularly as we've seen in the US and Europe. They've really, gone way over budget and over schedule. But, we have the expertise from these nuclear mega projects, these refurbishments, I think, to confidently say that we can do this, on budget and on schedule. Nothing's certain. And, I'll be frank, again, nuclear requires human excellence. That should be an inspiring story. The antis are like, well, humans suck. We have no faith in humanity. We should just all die. We should degrow, and there's too many people on the planet. And what I will say to them is, well, you first. You really believe that? Lead by example. I don't really believe that. I don't want anyone to commit suicide or die or anything like that. But anyway, that's a bit of a, offside thing there. But yeah, there's definitely a role for private industry within nuclear.
The tricky part is that it's hard for, I guess, your next door neighbor to go and become a nuclear entrepreneur. Do you view it as a government assisted industry, or how does it get off the ground, I guess, from an organic standpoint?
Well, my neighbor is a machinist. He runs a small machine shop, and he makes parts for the CANDU supply chain. So it is definitely possible for your neighbor to, be involved in the nuclear industry. It does involve some degree of government coordination and planning. And government is involved in electricity planning, right? Provincial government's mandate is to estimate what demand is going to be and sign contracts to meet that demand. And, things are Alberta, things are regulated differently than Ontario. I believe you're coming out of Alberta, and I think it's it's a power only market. People bid in minute to minute. There's not the same degree of coordination and planning that we have, say, here in Ontario. Deregulation, I should say. That's kind of what's happened in Alberta. But yeah, there's government involvement, and because of some of the unique challenges of radiation and of, the potential diversion, of nuclear fuel for weapons, it needs to be monitored closely. And so that's why there's, that degree of government involvement. And also, because these are multi-year projects, they require some degree of planning, I should say. So, I'm trying to think about oil and gas. Those are also big mega projects and multi-year projects. And again, if we can decriminalize nuclear, we can get it very cost competitive with things like coal and natural gas. And, I think what will drive that, appropriate regulation, will be a need for nuclear. And we're going to see that more and more, not everywhere and not necessarily in Alberta, right? Like, you guys are swapping your coal out for gas, which is positive. It's lower emitting. There's less air pollution. But you have assets now that are new gas generation assets that are going to last 30 years. And retiring those early is a big economic cost. We kind of missed the boat on replacing coal with nuclear in Alberta. Still a window of opportunity, I think, in Saskatchewan. And I think it is a better mix. Like, from a gas perspective, it's interesting. United Arab Emirates, for instance, huge LNG exporter. They were like, well, why would we get high on our own supply? The world needs our gas. Why would we be burning it? So they built the largest clean energy project in the Middle East, a massive 4 large nuclear reactor complex, which provides 25% of electricity. And so they're like, well, we'll export the stuff. So we'll benefit, especially because the Europeans have made some really stupid decisions, and the spot price is great. The long-term contract price is great. So, there's still a rationale for fossil fuel rich areas to invest in nuclear. The Russian dictator is a very unsavory character, but he's not stupid. And, Russia's built a lot of nuclear so they could export more of their gas and not burn it. So there's a rationale in fossil fuel rich areas to build nuclear as well. Certainly a rationale in fossil fuel scarce areas. But, eventually the world is going to run out of cheap, abundant, available fossil fuels. And so I really think a nuclear future is inevitable. It'd be nice if it happens on time to really help deal with the emissions problem and curb the worst impacts of climate change.
You've made inroads with the current federal government on proposing nuclear transition. Do you get a sense that they are taking the proposition seriously, or is it the same old empty platitudes?
Yeah, there's a lot of empty platitudes, particularly in terms of climate action, right? No government acts purely out of climate concern. There's a certain amount of like pork barrel politics and, subsidies, in Ontario. It's incredible. Our entire nuclear fleet, those 20 reactors we commissioned in 22 years, in inflation adjusted dollars, $55 billion. We've spent, and Alberta's doing similar ridiculous things with wind and solar, but we spent $60 billion subsidizing private developers to put wind and solar on the grid with just, insane rates of return. And that's really been scandalous in terms of driving up prices. And it gives you a sense of the affordability of each of these options. And wind and solar thing really drives me crazy because it's so poorly misunderstood. People say, well, they're so cheap, they're going to put coal out of business. They're cheaper than gas. Yeah, they don't understand the difference between these energy sources, right? And I always make a kind of I shouldn't say always. I'm going to test it out with you because I'm sort of developing this talking point, but electricity is not a commodity. It's a service, right? So you don't go to the electricity store and say, I'd like 1,000 electrons today. And they put it in a bag for you to take it home and empty the bag into some kind of device to get your power every day. No, it needs to be there, available, responding to your needs 24/7. And that's a lot like healthcare, which again is a service, not a commodity. And so what wind and solar are in this healthcare analogy are nurses and doctors who will work for very cheap, but if you're a solar doctor or nurse, you will never work a night shift. And if you're a wind doctor or nurse, you just work when you feel like it. And only when the weather conditions are just right, which is, it can be entirely absent for large portions of the time. Or, 90% of your workforce could decide not to come into work that day. So yeah, they're cheap. They're super cheap when they decide to work. But what happens when you need to run your hospital overnight, which you kind of need to run overnight because it's a service that maintains human lives. Well, then you need to have this really expensive on-call service of docs and nurses that charge a premium to show up, whenever wind decides the weather's nice, or solar decides they don't want to work a night shift. That drives up your systems costs because you don't pay for individual electrons coming out of a wind or solar farm. You pay for that service to be there. So I think that analogy, I'm just kind of working on it. I think it's very factful. And that's why you see in jurisdiction after jurisdiction that have gone gangbusters on wind and solar, you see the most expensive electricity prices. So that's that fundamental disconnect. And I think, it's really important for people to understand that, for that public education to occur. Because even from a decarbonization perspective, not terribly good decarbonizers. It's true that you'll burn, less fossil fuels. If wind can come on your grid and you can shut down your gas plants for a few hours, yeah, you burn a bit less gas. It's hard on the machinery. Don't get me wrong, that kind of thermal stress of cycling a gas plant up and down, it's not the most efficient way to burn gas, right? But yeah, you'll spare some fossil fuels. That doesn't lead to what we call deep decarbonization. You get some shallow decarbonization. And so, yeah, Your question, I went completely off course, was whether the federal government's serious or just virtue signaling. And they are serious because, and this is not necessarily just because of climate reasons. Ontario's forecasting a really huge increase in demand. And the Liberals understand that Ontario is an electoral battleground state. If you don't take Ontario, if you lose Ontario, you lose, federal government, and that there's some very pragmatic things that need to happen in Ontario to meet that demand. And so I think that's why they've shifted. I've been really, excited to be a big part of that. I think I've been a big part of what brought our environment and climate change minister, former Greenpeace activist, what brought him in line with the changed pro-nuclear position the federal government's taken. I ambush interviewed him and created a bit of a viral video phenomenon and a lot of media coverage when I challenged him at the climate conference in Glasgow at COP26. And I said, hey, minister, you have a strong principled record as an anti-nuclear activist. Will that cloud your judgment in the face of the growing scientific consensus that nuclear is, required to meet our climate goals? The IPCC itself says we're going to need to increase nuclear by 100 to 500%. Like, will you stand in the way of that because you're an anti-nuclear activist? And he totally dodged and did the typical politician thing on the question. He's been asked by conservative members questions about nuclear. He won't even stand up and answer the question. A different cabinet minister will. So very, very anti-nuclear. But the government's made a choice to pivot towards nuclear. I've been involved in advocating that they do so. Made a lot of allies in Ottawa, and they made the pivot. And I think Mr. Guilbeault was basically, do you want to keep your job as a cabinet minister or maintain your anti-nuclear position? And he was pragmatic. So he actually said, I've been someone who's been traditionally opposed to it, but I now recognize, the growing scientific consensus, we need nuclear. Like, he was basically repeating my line. So that was, personally very satisfying.
Well, we don't have all day. I know you're a busy guy. Maybe if we were to leave the listener 3 reasons why nuclear is a good solution for our energy requirements.
Are we talking to Alberta here? Are we talking to the whole country? What's your listenership?
Everybody.
Everybody. I mean, again, you tailor the message differently for different folks, but this is an incredibly misunderstood energy technology. Yeah. I mean, so for energy security reasons, right? For economic development reasons, and for, I've got this kind of slogan, for clean air, for a cool climate, and for sterile surgical instruments, vote nuclear. But I mean, you've made it this far through the podcast. I don't need to kind of expound on those reasons. So I'll just shut up now.
I think that's a real good primer for anyone that is interested in nuclear energy. Like we said, we don't have all day, but if someone wants to learn more about you and everything surrounding nuclear, where could they find you, and how do they do some more research on you?
Yeah. So I've got my DMs open on Twitter. It's at Dr._Keefer, K-E-E, F as in France, E-R. And I run the organization Canadians for Nuclear Energy. So if you just Google that, you'll find us there. There's a contact sheet there, and you can see what kind of campaigns we've been up to. We've been very active, and again, that's part of what's shifted the federal position on nuclear energy. We take a lot of pride in that. So that's the other place to find us. And then my podcast, it's Decouple Media, but the Decouple Podcast. It's available on all your podcasting platforms of choice. And that's, if you want to get a bit wonky and you're a bit nerdy, there's over 200 episodes there, so you can sort of pick whatever you're interested in. But we talk not just about nuclear, we talk a bit about agriculture, biotech, precision fermentation, precision agriculture, and some of the kind of environmental philosophy stuff, like really learning about and understanding, the background of mainstream environmentalism, because we got to understand it in order to wrestle with the worst factions of it.
Awesome. Well, why don't we wrap up the formal conversation there? Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Trevor. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed the episode. If you liked what you heard, check out rosebros.ca, where we will have upcoming shows. Until next time, happy coffee drinking.